Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are very excited to have Jim Massey with us. For those of you who haven't experienced a MentorCore event yet, thank you for joining us live. You may also be hearing us on the replay because we have found that people do enjoy going back and listening to these on replay because there are so many nuggets of wisdom. Uh, MentorCore was put together to support the compliance, risk, and security professions to help everybody feel a little less alone and make sure that we understand how people get into this profession and the wonderful variety of skills and talents that you can bring to bear in this place that we really love to work in. My name is Lisa Beth Lentini Walker, and I am one of the co-founders. And my partner in not crime
It's
is
Myla.
Dan.
Although I guess it's even better coming from somebody who's in compliance to say not a partner.
Right.
Hey, Lisa Beth, how are you?
Good. How are you, Dan?
I'm good. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dan Ayala, coming from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and ready to talk. So, Jim, thanks for joining us.
Hi.
So, Jim, can you tell us, first of all, I am a huge Jim Massey fan. I just am. From the minute I met you, I was like, this guy really, he gets it. So, Jim, I know that you've been honored in the past as a great mind in compliance. You've been doing all sorts of things in sustainability, but why don't you tell us your story?
Sure. And one of my most fun panels I've ever sat on, Lisa Beth and I were on, and it was almost like one of those moments where it's like we were raised together and we just started talking and it didn't end. And when it did, we're both like, that's too bad. So we kept it going. You know, I have come to accept that I was born to build our better. Early on in my life, and this goes back to being raised in the Midwest in Missouri, spending my summers at my grandparents' farm on Lake Meadow Woods in southern Missouri, where grandpa would tell us, run as far as the fence, and then if the imagination takes you further, go beyond. And really learning that the barriers that we put up for ourselves come here, but the world isn't our oyster. Fast forward to where I am today, and I think the best way to describe who I am is I'm a white cisgendered Christian male of Western descent, heterosexual, married with children, and I'm listing all my privileges because one of the easy things that I get to do is enter into every room and feel welcome and like I belong. And so, what I have found over the last 20 years of my profession is though I was raised not understanding what that is, where I am today about building our better is trying to change the structures that hold other people back so that we all can have that same sense of belonging, the same sense of purpose, and the same sense of being able to show up as we want to show up. And that's why I've kind of found my way into compliance from consumer marketing. I started early in my career in politics to consumer marketing, learning how to change people's behaviors. And I started wanting to do it for good and ethics, and I ended up in compliance and now in the ESG space. So all of that is a quick summary of how from a farm kid to where I am in my profession today, I've accepted I'm here to build our better from the inside out so that everyone can have the same privileges I experience today.
I love that your grandfather instilled at an early age the infinite possibility.
Yeah.
And I think that's a mindset. We talk a lot about mindset because, MentorCore is really about all of the things that go into personal growth and development that are not technical skills, right? So that mindset that supports saying, what if? Some people don't get the opportunity to be asked that question early on. And those self-limiting behaviors and thoughts do a lot of damage and limit. So bravo to your grandfather. And I love the way that you talk about this as a way
Thank
to
you.
reduce those barriers so everyone can be in this together.
Thank you. It's funny. It wasn't until we were later in life that my granddad said, "You crossed over the fence." We're like, we thought you said, he's like, no, it was to use your imagination. He's like, that, because it went into Mark Twain National Forest. He's like, you could have been lost over there. And so that's the other part of that story. But you're exactly right. The mindset he instilled in us was life changing for all of us kids.
That's
So pretty
absolutely
fortunate.
amazing.
And
Absolutely amazing.
have you found over time that you've been able to continue that level of veracity toward heading into the unknown, as your grandfather, the wiser sense, or
Yes.
the more rational sense took over when he found out that you had gone beyond the fences. As we grow, our brains are doing more of that rational, and try to bleed us of that kind of unrefined go into the unknown. How have you been able to temper that?
It's been a challenge because I tempered it too much.
Mm.
And Dan, you can't say into the unknown without into the unknown. Yeah, I can't sing, but
Yes, exactly.
but
Points for Jim Massey.
but very sincerely, there was quite some time early in my career, especially when I transitioned from consumer marketing, having all the power. I worked for a major consumer packaged good company. And so when I went into compliance, it was about, we put the no into innovation. And so, for me to be in that place, I started to have to shift the organization, and I found I started to hide myself a little bit because they're like, you're too bold. And then finally it's like, wait, we're holding the business back. And what we became in the compliance function it was a badge of honor to be the no people. And the reality of it was the business would shut down if we had our way. And so, when I talk about transforming from the inside out, instead of trying to convince the business compliance was good, I had to convince compliance professionals that we could show up differently and still achieve the same thing. And so genuinely, it was the plan to transform ourselves, to transform the enterprise, because the biggest challenge were the people who had built careers on being able to delineate between words to keep writing policy. And this badge of honor that they knew every word in a policy when no one else did, they felt it was a job security. And so, one of the big transitions I had to do was, again, I use humor a lot, but I kept saying, when you put when the emphasis is on the wrong syllable, no one can understand you. And what I was using that for was, we kept talking policy that no one read. And so we had to start looking at controls. We had to start looking at training and communications. We had to start rethinking what our compliance program was. It had always been laid out there and everyone knew the elements, but everyone focused on policy. And that was going to be the death of us because the emphasis was on the wrong syllable.
So, question for you.
Yes.
You talked a little bit about getting into compliance from marketing. What made you do that? Like, how do you decide this is the moment. Here's my pivot. I'm going to go from being in marketing, which is like super snazzy, to compliance, which is like pretty much anything but snazzy.
Tomorrow I shall wake up and become a kookaburra.
Yes, right. Yes. And for me, it was simply to get a job. So a mentor of mine at my previous company had told me that instead of going back, my undergraduate degree was in marketing. And so I was trying to think about, what would help me. And through her advice, I went back for a master's in organization development, and I specialized in individual accountability.
Oh.
And so then what I wanted to do was come back to the commercial organization and help marketers realize, when you adjust your forecast down 4 times at the end of the year, you don't get to say we hit our forecast.
But it's so much more fun
with that.
Right. And so I was in the sales organization. My employer, Johnson & Johnson, wanted me to move back to New Jersey. My wife had just landed her dream job in Washington, D.C. And we also had just had our son, 1 month old. And my wife's like, could we keep, I was a trailer spouse, I had been following her. She's a broadcast journalist, and she's like, I just found my dream job. Can we stay? So in an interview process, they didn't have enough people for me in the commercial side. And so they put in the general counsel in the interview. And during the interview, the general counsel said, individual accountability, that's kind of what we're trying to do with compliance. And he's like, would you ever consider helping me? I'm like, no, I'm not ready to retire. Because at the time, in pharmaceutical industry, that's where all the regional managers went to die. They would leave their sales
They went to compliance to die?
and they went into compliance because they knew the sales organization, but they would spend their last 3 or 4 years and no one wanted to be in there. And he laughed. He's like, no, like, we can build it, make it snazzy. And I said, would it help me get the job? And he's like, yes. And I said, I would love to help you build your compliance program. And
Smart answer.
so I was in charge of leadership capabilities for the commercial organization and building out the commercial compliance program. And then that's when it clicked for me. That was leadership development, doing the right thing, time in and time out, regardless of anti-bribery, privacy, off-label promotion, hiring, managing, advising, succession planning. They were one of the same. And that's really the turning point in my career, that I realized we had the wrong idea what compliance was. Compliance was not that negative piece. And so, Dan, to your question, that's when I started to realize I could actually build something. I could set a new vision, galvanize employees and myself to rethink what compliance was and change it for good, both in permanence and impact. And that's what I did over the next 10 years.
Wow.
Nice.
So one of the things that strikes me about this is that marketing in general, very good at storytelling and about influencing behaviors. And you went and you got, an advanced degree in kind of individual accountability, how people do what they do, how to make them want to do the right things. And that's an area that I think compliance has struggled with so much. And right now you see it in science, right?
Absolutely.
Being able to just not read from a research paper or from a policy, but to be able to tell those stories is so important. So what do you think about the magic of storytelling, not only in this profession, but like across the risk professions?
Yes. It's the only way. It's the longest art form that's been passed down from mankind generation to generation. It's why I started singing Into the Unknown, which is my generation with my children. But you go as far back, right, as the Three Little Pigs. In the Black Forest of Germany and its origination. And I do a training for anyone who works for me, because you'll see my purpose is to build our better. Mm-hmm. I often speak in words of threes, in little phrases. And I got that. My mom taught folklore, and my wife is a broadcast journalist. So I'm surrounded by strong leaders who happen to be the most influential women in my life who love words. And so, I learned from a very early stage, as well as through honing this within my own skills, the criticality of being able to tell my story in 3 words that people can understand what it is I'm trying to do. And so that's why do the right, the right thing, do the right is often how I will summarize compliance, just simply the right thing, an arrow, and I use image like FedEx. So it's the arrow is always pointed to the right when people see the branding. Mm-hmm. Transform ourselves are 3 words, technically 2, but, yeah. But, it's being able to summarize the story and then making sure all data points support that. So I think storytelling is a critical part of not only how I operate, but how we as humans retain information and understand. So I can tell you the risk, right, is if you don't wear your mask during COVID, you may infect others. Or I can tell you, don't kill grandma.
Right.
Which makes more sense to you? I don't want to kill my grandma. So you know what? I can wear a mask. Right. And I think those are just one tangible example of how, when you go from just a specific rule to application of ethics, how the story and narrative can quickly change.
Wow,
Does that apply? Does that apply the same in the more structured fields? You know, you were in CPG, you were in pharma, and in the hard sciences where data and facts are the drivers, not versus versus the broader picture. Have you been able to take the same approach there in those markets?
I have, because pharma, I don't know an industry that's more science-based than pharma.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm sticking with the COVID example of vaccines, right? But if you think about the narrative time and time again, or and it was always interesting to watch the scientists because they wanted to challenge me as a commercial marketer, because I'm kind of a smooth talker. I'm inherently, as a former, someone who started out early on in politics, who then went into sales, I could sleaze some people out with my, though it's authentic, people have trouble believing I'm this energized all the time. But again, I was raised, you love or hate, life is too short to like. So I'm either in or out. And if I'm in, you get me, right? You get all of me. And so the scientists always were like, this doesn't make sense. But then time and time again, when I'm talking about the environment, or one of the biggest pushbacks I had was in our product environmental stewardship. So over time, we took ethics that, so my job in sustainability was the environment, social, and governance. And people always thought, sustainability professionals come from environment or social. It's now all about the governance, because
Mm-hmm.
the boards and the CEOs are making all these commitments. We're going to be carbon neutral by a certain time. We'll protect you, employees, from COVID. We will do the right thing. Black Lives Matter. So they're making all these commitments. They need to have governance. The organization is matching up to what they're committing to. And so, though compliance, I built governance for anti-bribery, anti-corruption, and privacy, I can build governance for any topic, insert here. And so, fast forward to product environmental stewardship with my scientists, they were like, well, we're here to discover the next molecule. Perfect. When you discover it, how you decide to stabilize it will have an impact on the environment and access to healthcare, the social justice of a pharmaceutical company. And you're telling me you're doing this for patients, but you're doing it in cold chain, which now means low to middle income countries will never see this product.
Right.
So I'm no longer impressed with your science if it cannot get to the patients who need it. And that's a different type of storytelling that I would talk about being in the villages in Africa, working on things with Healthy Heart Africa and saying, you're doing this, but you're just doing it for the rich white people, not impressed anymore. And boy, that would really start to bring forward a different type of scientific rigor of why am I in this field? To first do no harm, but in the simple designation of how you're stabilizing that molecule, you're doing harm.
Very.
And that really helped start. It started to shift how they started to do drug discovery.
So you mentioned governance, and it's one of my favorite topics. And it crosses across compliance, security, risk, everywhere. But I think sometimes we have different definitions of governance. It's being used so many different ways. When you talk about governance, what do you think about there? What are your thoughts about what the future of governance is, and why potentially we may need to work together better?
Oh, so I boil governance down into 4 buckets.
Okay.
It's purpose. The purpose is why we're doing what we're doing on any topic. And then it turns into policy. What are the guardrails we're establishing that then determine our practices? And then ultimately the people who need to do it. And that can go everywhere from the employee on the manufacturing floor or in the lab to the chairman of the board of directors. Who needs to know what, when, and how do we get all of that purpose, policy, practice, and people aligned and informed at the same time?
Wow.
And that for me is governance.
Is it safe to say that the role of communications is greater than that, is perhaps the greatest component of success when it comes to insert governance, compliance, ethics, any of the fields that we talk about? It feels like this is an inevitable trend.
Say it again. I'm still processing.
Sorry. Effective communication is the key to success in these fields.
I believe it is probably, right? But here's my one hesitation. We're in the digital revolution. And so part of one of the things I think we're going to start to see is controls, the practices. And I want to say those are forms of communication, right? When I think of communication, it's not just the words, it's verbal, nonverbal, but it's also, you know, the controls that are put in place in the automation of things are still a way in which we communicate purpose to the organization, you know, in the governance model. So I'm taking a very broad perspective on what communication is and not just thinking of human kind of communication, but the cultural communications, the keys and the cues that this is how we operate. And so within the expense reporting system, you cannot spend more than you're supposed to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or when it comes to hiring practices, we are going to make sure that we don't use pronouns that can offend the non-binary colleagues who want to come work for us. And so those are all controls that we can put in the HR system that still communicate through an impact of a sensory. So yes, I would say effective communications is key.
Yeah, I like that you keep it broad too in terms of controls, because part of what you've talked about is cultivating environments that allow people to not only have possibilities and be at their best and shine, but also limit them from doing their worst in an unfettered fashion.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I think all of those things go together because, you know, Dan, in the security world, controls are very important.
Well, they are, but I'd argue that they are. We're to the point where adding more controls is not gaining. We're back in that 10% again. We're not gaining anything materially more. Now the value comes, and this is part of the root of my original question. Now the value comes from effectively building relationships within the organization, so people understand why and how. Being able to translate these things into business value, to say, by doing this, we're going to build reputational trust. We're going to build a better relationship with our customer in the B2C worlds, or allow our B2B partners to be able to do better, to be able to do that with their customers, and therefore build brand, build trust, build revenue. And it all has security and privacy are no longer just about firewalls. It's about delivering business value just like any other portion of the business.
Yes.
And that's and part of it is effectively communicating those. And so that's where I see a lot of this coming together in the big gap area has long been how you communicate it. Technologists aren't always the greatest at communicating,
Yes.
nor are risk professionals good at quantifying. They're great at quantifying, but not necessarily turning that into a so what statement. So what? We're going to have these 43 things happen. Okay, so what? Can I not sell? Can I not buy? Can my customers not do what they need to do? Those kind of so what.
Do we have to wear purple socks on Thursdays?
Right. Right. Yeah. You know, Dan, it's interesting you talk about that because I'll never forget I was traveling in India, and the site leader at the facility I was visiting chose to put me up at a hotel that she felt was more accommodating for a Westerner.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was there for dinner, my server asked me for money. And so all of a sudden, you know, a flag starts going off in my head. And so I'm talking to the server. I'm like, you know, can you explain to me, you're working here, why would you ask for additional cash? He's like, well, they don't pay us, but every month.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm going through modern day slavery and human trafficking concerns. And I'm thinking, am I at a preferred vendor that we have screened for this type of activity? And so I start asking, I'm
And
like, well,
do you screen the restaurants that you're going to?
right. Well,
Right?
so this was within the hotel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was like,
And so
whoa.
yeah. But just so you know, then I'm like, well, you know, so if they only pay you, you know, how do you take care of your rent and things? Like, oh, well, I live with 7 other men in a home provided, and they provide transportation to and from, and they did the same from my village. So I'm now
Oh.
texting the site lead saying, is this a preferred hotel? I'm having a very uncomfortable conversation, and I have a duty of care at this point to talk to the general manager of the property. Because there's now money from my former employer, a UK-based company, going into this facility. So long story short, it was not a preferred vendor. They thought I would be more comfortable because it was fancier. The general manager assured me that they were paid twice a month, that they don't provide transportation from the village to, so I was asking some of these questions way beyond what I needed to do, but it's just as a humanitarian, I needed to understand what was going on here. If I needed to talk, I was not comfortable enough. I went ahead and made a statement to local authorities about my concerns about the property. I had to, but I was able to go back at the town hall the next day and talk about why we have controls in place about selecting preferred vendors only.
Hmm.
And from there, we added that to our code of ethics training that year. Because people are always, as Westerners, we think, well, it's Marriott or Hilton, I need to keep my loyalty points. But when we are sending employees to low to middle income countries, and we have a presence in more than 70, people may not, they may not be doing that. They may be locally owned franchises. And there's a reason why we do this type of protocol. So that, Lisa Beth, like you said, just go, if you stay at a preferred vendor, we can assure you it's consistent with what our companies want to do in our supply chain.
Yep.
And it was just one of those moments for me that they thought they were doing me a favor, but they actually exposed me to an inappropriate vendor that I could not, even with their validation to me, feel comfortable enough just to walk away.
Wow.
And that was something I wasn't expecting to do outside of Chennai, India on that business trip.
Very interesting.
Wow. So let's talk a little bit about environmental, social, and governance because
Yes.
we don't have a ton of members to date that understand a lot about this. And frankly, I think that there's a huge hole in the knowledge sets for compliance and security and sometimes for risk around what's going on with ESG and why does it matter to me?
Mm-hmm.
So tell me how you got into it and kind of what you see happening right there now.
So after I overhauled our ethics and compliance program at AstraZeneca, my leadership asked me if I would do the same for the safety, health, and environment team. And so one of the things I always say, stepping in the unknown, I said yes. Sure. So that meant I had to learn. And inevitably, right? What's the natural way people respond to someone different? It's not going to work out. And so I had to dive in and learn new topics of safety, health, and environment. But it comes back to, why are we doing this? What are the policies? What are our practices? And who needs to do what? We started to quickly learn everyone in the organization drove the environmental practices. But where the gap existed, Lisa Beth, is the connection between that risk and the enterprise risk management process.
Right.
And so we had to start bringing in the board annually was approving that climate, global warming was the phrasing, was a long-term risk. Yet we're in the decade of our lives. We have 10 years to hit the sustainable development goals. So I'm going to use a lot of terms here, but it's easy. I learned it. And it was only 5 years ago I started learning this stuff. But we moved to take those risks and put them into the enterprise risk management system because they were ever present. Remember when I was in Chennai, I talked about the example. The reason I was there is we had just opened up an IT facility. We had 2,500 employees, and there was torrential flooding that had taken place just a few months after we opened. Fast forward to 2018, Chennai is one of the 20 cities in India that by 2020 would not have access to drinkable water for all of its citizens. And we've seen that take place. So we have 2,500 employees in I think it's the sixth largest city in India with not a secure source of drinkable water. That's a risk to an enterprise if your IT facility is there. From a
Oh, for
security
sure.
standpoint, from an employee safety, health, and well-being, from an environmental risk. So all of these aspects, and we had it as a future risk. So we changed it to global heating. We turned it into an immediate risk for today.
Right.
And that we did that in 2019. And so we ended up bringing that in. And over time, our ethics and compliance team became global sustainability. and the professionals, because they're risk experts, we had to transform and train them that it was okay to get comfortable, insert any risk, whether it's environment, social justice, insert here, and we can talk risk. But it was a transformation I had to get employees comfortable with, because they were so used to being deep subject matter experts that I had to retrain them. You still are. It's just this is your field and you're bilingual. And you will learn the
Mhm.
language as you enter the new country, but you will always have the universal language of risk as your expertise.
I really like the way that you frame that. And it's something that Dan and I have talked about a lot, which is learning the language of these multiple areas, right? We're at a point where no one can be ignorant about cybersecurity risk. You
Yeah.
just can't. We're working, most of us are we're still working from home, and the risks are there. They're more profound now than ever before,
Yes.
really. And I've seen a reticence in the compliance profession to uh, learning the language of information security, to learning the language of environmental, social, and sometimes even to learning the language of ethics, because
Yes.
they're like, not me. And I'm like, oh, yes, we.
Yes.
We.
And I'll extend that even into the more traditional risk areas like credit risk, FX risk, the more financial side risks. That those are areas where have been the domain of the CFO, and a lot of people do get hesitant to start to to try to learn those areas if they're not in those organizations. And I think understanding them helps us all do our risk mindset much better.
Yes. So and Lisa Beth, one thing that I would maybe add to the conversation about learning the new language is we can cheat with just hello, how are you, where's the bathroom questions, right?
Right.
So, though I use the alliteration of the P's on purpose, policy, practice, and people, it's why, how, what, and who. So we can sit here and I can fake it with those four questions. So Dan, you're a security guy. You could give me any topic you want. And I'd be like, so why do I care? So how would I go about this cybersecurity with my computer? And you start training and teaching me.
Mhm.
So what does that look like on this topic? And who is that, just me and you, or is it R&D? Is it commercial? And now all of a sudden I have my four P's figured out by simply asking why, how, what, and who. And that's how you start to learn a new language. You start with the shared language, and then people teach you the native language. It's, for me, that's the simplicity of embracing you're a subject matter expert of risk, and owning that, and then having the curiosity back as a child to ask the question that we were conditioned to stop asking.
Wow. I really, really like that framework. And I think it's going to be something that is really helpful for a lot of people, because sometimes, we forget to ask for help, right? Like, and this is really hard, especially as people grow within their career, right? Or, they graduate from school and they're expected to know it, right? Because you know it.
Yes, yes.
And so um, that level of vulnerability in leadership to say, tell me more, what, why,
Bingo.
who, um, I think it's hard for some people to feel like it's okay to ask those questions, because it does feel vulnerable, and because in some cases people have been conditioned not to ask questions, because if you ask questions you might look like you don't know what you're doing.
Yes. Or, we'll couch, I hate to ask a stupid question, or sorry for the stupid, but all of these are those self-induced barriers that I kicked off with.
Yeah.
No one, more than likely, if you have a question, someone around on the Zoom in the meeting will have the same one. And if they don't, you may trigger a better one by simply asking yours. Why again are we talking about this? It could trigger, like, you just never know the simplicity, which then brings back to Dan, communication is key, right?
So one of the terms that I've heard you use in the past, and I don't know if you're still using it, is I think it was Business is Us.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because at the time, I loved the phrase, and I think it's a really good one.
Thank you. Yeah. I want to shorten, I will never go back to business as usual. And the reason for that is it wasn't. It was hierarchical, patriarchal, racist. It was protecting the few. And so I've been saying that during Mother Nature's timeout for us as humankind, I'm going to shorten business as usual to business as us and bring humanity back to work. And that's it. And so I as I return to work, I refuse to accept anything that's normal. We're also experiencing the fastest change we've ever experienced, so fast that people have trouble keeping up, that businesses can't and laws cannot. And so in the compliance field, if we're still trying to, write policy to laws, we've already missed the boat. Things are so it's about how we as humans are going to be operating with each other, communicating with each other. I will only go back to business as us, and anything that falls after us, I'm not willing to address. So that's the basis of the business as us.
Love it. Absolutely love it.
Thank
So
you.
you talk a little bit about addressing some of the systemic problems. Um, how does one go about addressing systemic problems? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, um, I just lean forward and go for it, right? I used to say, I used to fight that I had no privilege, that it wasn't me. And then a friend introduced me to the concepts of learning, asking why. So why? What is privilege? And it's just privilege is just power. And I promise you, this show today was not brought to you by the letter P, but I keep all
It
the
would be
words.
okay if it was.
It is.
Plosives rule the day.
Right. But I think for me, it's simply looking back that just because I have privilege doesn't make me bad. It's just when I try to protect it only for me, then I'm a jerk. And so how do I go about, and some of the things I talk about is, I'm actually going to be starting a podcast soon, because
I was hoping
one
you'd mention that.
one of the things that bugs me is I'm in job transition mode. And in the field, I have become frustrated that many of the positions I'm looking for are going and becoming diversity officer roles. And
Mhm.
I started to fall into the zero-sum game that they wouldn't consider a white guy for it. And in that same day, I started to read that the number one C-suite turnover position is that of the chief diversity officer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because people of color or women are hired into those positions, and people that look like me don't listen to them, and they don't set them up for success. So here I am viewing this as a zero-sum game, thinking that I need that position when I'm actually doing what the other white guys are doing and not listening to what's being said. And so I'm working with the team right now, and there'll be more coming out. But I decided that the podcast is going to be, is this seat open? What happens when the white guy leaves his table? And it's about, what I started to do at my work is I started going and sitting with people that didn't look like me and I'd never met before. And I would just say, is this seat open? And they'd be like, yeah. And I was starting to learn so much. And when I started doing that, people started telling me about that. One individual gave me the gift of this, oh, I have to wear my mask work. And she was talking about how she thinks about her hairstyle. This was 5 years ago. And I'm like, you don't wear your hair natural. She's like, no, you guys would not like it, and she's a woman of color and her hair was really full. And I thought, you can't tell this because I'm shellacked, right? It's all, but I told my team, I'm like, guys, I'm going to come to work for a week with my natural hair and not wear hair product. But I want everyone to feel as though they can do that. And so when I don't have this, my hair is pretty puffy. I've got a lot of kink and curl. And I would come to work and I was like, what's up with the hair? I'm like, why do you ask? I'm not asking you about your hair. But I started to have this conversation, and then in meetings, like with executives, like, what's going on with your hair? I'm like, why do you ask? Why? Right? Start with why. Well, it's just different. Oh, okay. And then I just start the meeting. So
I wish I was a fly on the wall for some of these meetings. I got to tell you.
well, but you know, as a white guy, no one said anything back. It's just different. Oh, okay. But see, different starts to talk about inclusion, doesn't it?
Mhm.
And as a white guy with an executive position, I could sit at that table and say, okay, and then just start meeting. And then at the end of the week, no one said anything. I would walk into meetings, everyone had seen my hair, no one thought anything about it. So then every time I would come back to, and then in a town hall at our site with 2,200 employees, I brought it up and said, for a week I came in with my hair and everyone kept asking me why. Do you know that some of our colleagues never show up naturally because we judge them and will point out their hair is different? By the end of the week, people stop doing that. So if you see someone with different hair, note it, but don't feel that you need to mention it because they probably know their hairstyle is different than the day before. And
Yeah.
it's just those types of conversations. But all of that came about because I had, from a position of power and privilege, the ability to say, is that seat open? And what I need more white men to do is listen to others so that we can start to shape shift the barriers that are holding them back from helping us find the solutions we need for our environment, our social, and our governance. And that's what I'm going to try to do.
I so love that you're going to do this podcast. I'm definitely signing up to listen to it.
Thank you.
And I mean, I think your example of hair is really profound. And I'll tell you, as a woman, when I decided that it was okay for my sparkles to shine, I got a lot of feedback. In fact, people would tell me, for my executive photos, like, looks good. You just look older because you have some gray there. Do you realize that? You realize you're going gray? And I'm
No,
like,
no, I'd never noticed.
Yeah. No, every morning when I'm brushing my hair, I don't see it.
well, and it's funny because what's considered distinguished in male executives,
Yes.
is considered like I'm not caring for myself, especially for female executives, right? There's a double standard and a bias that goes into it that's somehow been permitted to shine
Yes. It's
beyond the sparkles that I have.
I know. And these are the things that we do all the time. And we call them unconscious bias, which I'm struggling with, and I always try to talk about, and some other things that I'm struggling with the D&I conversation is I'm never going to use the word ally again because it still gives white men the power. I'm open to thought partner, but the people I'm going to be featuring on my podcast do not need allies. They know what they're doing and they are accomplishing it. What they don't need are people blocking them. That's not an ally. And so I just want to start challenging, even once again, when we talk D&I, we're trying to make white men comfortable. And, I think a lot of it comes back to, even the recent election with President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris. You know, many people during the presidential debates were like, oh, Senator Harris just called out Vice President Biden at the time. And she was holding him accountable for words and actions he took that impacted her. I don't think that's calling out anybody. It's saying that little girl was me were her words. And that he came back and brought her to the ticket, and they just appointed an all-female communication staff
I did
of
see that.
great diversity. It's that's what we need in every organization, are white men not viewing it as a zero-sum game. That why are we doing this? For innovation. Why are we doing this? D&I means we need new solutions to problems. And if all we're bringing are the same white people, we're going to get the same solutions, and they're not working. And so that's why, how, what, and who really matter more than ever. And that's just, and that's why compliance professionals need to be thinking about this. We need new innovation in ethics. So let's start going to the HBCUs and thinking differently about our recruitment process. If you're a compliance professional on here and you don't have recruitment, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but I moved my money from Wachovia when the CEO came out and said there's just not the black talent.
I didn't know that you had done that. I mean,
Yeah.
not that I know your banking history or
Oh
anything,
no,
but
yeah, and I said Wachovia, but it's Wells Fargo.
By the way.
Yeah, yeah, but it's Wells Fargo. And one of my favorite examples I can tell you is, so then I called financial institutions looking to put the money somewhere. And when I did that, I made a call to one, and they're like, "Oh yes, of course. We can have one of our financial advisors. Because the other thing I have is stature and wealth. I'm not going to pretend. I've been in this industry for a long time, and I have more than two dimes. And so when I called the bank said, "Oh, Mr. Massey, we can have an advisor for you. It's 8:15. We could have someone at 9, 9:30, 10, all day." I said, "Perfect." The thing of it is I need it to be a person of color and ideally a woman.
they
And
must have thought that was an interesting request.
there was a minute of silence on the phone. I timed it because there was no, and he's like, "Well, we don't segregate our employees that way." And I laughed out loud and I said, "Oh my goodness, I felt like I was in 1968. I apologize because I was born in 73 and I've not heard the word segregation, only in training." I said, "What I'm asking for is inclusion of talent. I'm leaving Wells Fargo because of the racist comments made by its CEO. And I'm trying to make a point." Now, let's be honest, Wells Fargo is not going to miss my money, but I cannot leave with that. And so in the end, what ended up happening was they found someone for me 2 weeks later, and it was just a white woman.
Hmm.
My first request was a person of color, and then ideally a woman. Just trying to break 95% of financial advisors are white men.
Right.
So I was trying to, just challenge that. Ends up, long story short, the woman wasn't able to make the call. A man calls and says, "Mr. Massey, sorry, this person couldn't make it." And I said, "That's fine. Before we continue, I need you to confirm you're not white." And he laughed. He's like, "I'm not." And then the craziest thing is 4 questions later, he's married to a woman I've known since my junior year of high school.
Oh,
Oh, neat.
And so the universe does bring it back together. And so it's ironic. And she was one of the few women of color, that I was in speech and debate with, that I went to university with, and she's been a lifelong friend. And she got on the phone, she's like, he said, "Oh, I've got some white guy trying to throw his power around. This should be interesting." And then she's like, "It's you, like it's for good. We can't believe it," because he didn't know what he was getting. And he is the best advisor I have ever experienced.
oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And I'm so
Absolutely
glad it worked out.
fantastic.
So in cases where you have direct one-on-one interaction, or you have the leverage, again, using the privilege to be able to make those things happen is one case. And leading by example is another. But overcoming some systemic issues and not being written off for making such a request is something I hear a lot. People who aren't in those positions. And do you have any
Yes.
advice for people that are trying, and let's bring this back into the compliance field, is there people who are trying
Yes.
to drive these kinds of changes or set these kinds of cultures, but may not have all of the leverage that
Yes.
that they need
Yes.
to do so quite so quickly?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite examples is, I'll give you two, right? And again, it's the challenge you gave me is without the leverage, but I want to use, so
Sure.
pay equity was something that was driving me crazy, right? I didn't understand it. And so as a company, we were saying, what about, let's have a target of a certain time. So in 2015, my former organization had a goal that we would have 37% of women in leadership roles. And I kept challenging, why isn't it 50? I don't understand why we're going for 37, other than we're at 36.5 and we'll be able to hit that. So I instituted 50% for myself. But then the other thing that bugged me as a line manager was that I had a leadership team of all white men from the 3 Western countries we were operating in, but I was on all 6 continents. And we had no controls in place. But as a line manager, I could do something about it. So over the next 18 months, I worked with my HR team to do the appropriate succession planning, so on and so forth, so that by 2017, I had pay equity at all levels of my organization. And I had 40% nation of origin diversity representation on my former all white male team.
Wow.
And what happened to the other white males? Some retired, but I found them places for them to continue to flourish. But many were in their position for 10 years. They were blocking. And so it's about helping people find their next avenue and also giving others greater opportunity. And so, Dan, I give that as one example because then what I was able to do is I went around from every town hall since the board and the executive team weren't willing to put stakes in the ground that we want to pay equity. I'm like, as the company continues to solve that globally for 72,000, raise your hand if you're a line manager. Everyone raised their hands. You can create pay equity for your teams today.
Right.
Look and correct.
Yeah. And
You know,
it starts with small actions from
it
lots
does.
of people, right? You can't expect there's going to be a grand solution and somebody's going to fix all your problems.
No.
Bring it back around to the 100%, the 90%. You can do these are the pieces you can control, and
Yes.
you wait for perfect, it'll never happen.
So,
One other thing I always want to say too is I always say, have you reached out to someone who's a female or a person of color that was recently promoted and said, how can I support you? So if you're not a line manager, because we often just sit back and be like, oh, that'll be interesting. Screw that. Make it not interesting. Engage and make sure they succeed because all eyes are on them. And in the new open era, where it's all glass, sometimes those individuals are seen before they enter the space. Right. And so as individuals, don't sit back. If someone is in a new position, if it's a woman, if it's a person of color, if it's nation of origin, reach out, congratulate, contact them, ask them what they need to be successful, tell them you're vested in their success and you want to see them. Congrats. What more can I do? Those are things that individual contributors can do if you don't have the line management purview as well. So sorry, Elizabeth, I just had to add that for
I
that other dimension.
love that.
That was time well spent.
It was totally time well spent. So, couple of things from the chat. People are looking forward to being subscribers to your podcast and interested in being guests too. So we can talk about that for you later. But there was a person who specifically asked, can we talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion in compliance? And I think probably insecurity too.
Yes.
This is something we need to work on. Thoughts
Yes.
and observations. I'm like, whoa, boy, do we
security at 95% male is all right.
Yes.
Obviously, I'm joking.
Right.
100%. It's a necessity in all the fields. Yes.
Right. So, do you have some thoughts and observations on that, Jim? I love that what you said about fixing your own house when you can.
Yes, you have to, right? And for me, through my network, there's a remarkable leader named Deborah T. Owens who runs Alley Cat, which is a community of like professional networking for people of color to navigate corporate America. So it's a very U.S. focused thing. Nice. So I started to network with her, and people. I had an executive say, do you know someone in HR? I'm like, who's of color? I'm like, not top of head. However, I want you to contact Deborah T. Owens because she will. That's what she does. And then someone was saying that they kind of heard a similar Wells Fargo statement by a PR agency executive. And someone reached out and said, hey, could you give me a list of 5 people of color who are senior executives in corporate affairs? I'm like, here are my 5. And then I queued them in and I said, hey, I need more names of people who look like you. Let's prove them wrong. And boy, they galvanized, and so we have to create these networks, because typically what happens is we start to build our teams and we want to replicate those teams, but they look like this. And so we've got to do that. And the answer is yes. But a couple of other things that I was able to do, I took away the salary questions. I took away educational background. So there are things that are inherently prejudice in our job applications we do. So look, I'm a marketer, but I built a strong career and was recognized by compliance because the top mind in compliance without a law degree. So why does a compliance professional need to have a JD? I'm a behavioralist. I know how to change human behavior to be consistent with values. that's really what compliance is about. Now, if you have a J degree, JD, wonderful. I'm not saying it's bad,
Yeah.
but most jobs have that. So if you eliminate those, think about how many more people now you have access to. So those are just some little things that we could start doing immediately that I did. And once I took off the educational requirements, when I took off salary requirements, all the things that are big issues in D&I were no longer the case. I told HR, let's tell them what we want to pay, and then they decide if they want to keep interviewing.
Yeah.
And
Shift
once
the
you take
power.
educational pieces off, it's not just the people who didn't get the degree yet. It's the people who would never have had access to ever get there, but might have the capabilities
Absolutely.
and are and then and may be afraid to even apply because they don't have it, or will get filtered out by it.
Or they may not have the funds to be able to go to school
Right. They would.
and
Yeah.
take care of a family or whatever they have.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Right. So, and I know like this has been so much fun and it
Well,
kills me
It's
because
been
we
a
have to
treat.
ask the last question.
Yes.
But what is the best advice you ever received from a mentor, Jim?
Well, remember when I talked about going back to graduate school? It's from Michelle Brennan. She was a company group chairman of Johnson and Johnson, who was a mentor of mine. I was the youngest consumer marketer on the Tylenol franchise, and I only had an undergraduate degree from a top 25 program. But my boss had told me, you're the same as a high school student without your MBA from a top tier program. In comes the new vice president, Michelle. She's like, well, they're going to hate me because all I have is my undergrad degree. We hit it off. And so through her mentorship, she said, the biggest issue you're going to have is not business. It's getting people not to throw sand in the sandbox. And she encouraged me to go back for a degree in organization development, understanding human behavior. She's like, you have that in your marketing, but understand how to get people to play well together. And that's why, I love this, no throwing toys from the pram, right? You can have your temper tantrum, but in the end of the day, we control what's here, which means we don't get to throw them at someone, And so that was the best advice I'd ever received, because without that, I would never gotten into compliance.
Wow. Wow. Well, it pains me to end this because I think we could go on for another hour or more.
Well, it
And
was a treat. Thank you.
you have been such a delightful guest. And as soon as we've got all the details about your podcast, we will be highlighting it for all of the
Thank
people
you.
on our newsletter so that they can listen in. I know I will be one of the first in line to try to listen to everything that you have to say, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a
Thank you
treat.
for being here, Jim. We really appreciate it. And thanks for
Thanks for
continuing
including
to
me.
drive this message so loudly and so
Absolutely.
clearly.
All
Thank you.
right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And this will be available on replay later. We really appreciate you being part of this MentorCore community.